Story 1. The Faceless Cry. I've always loved the quiet of the woods at night. There's something soothing about the way the trees sway in the darkness, their branches reaching like silent witnesses to the stars. For as long as I can remember, I've gone on nightly walks to clear my head. It's become a ritual of sorts, a way to escape the noise of the day and lose myself in the serenity of the forest. But that night was different. It was just past midnight when I left the house, flashlight in hand, and headed down the familiar trail. The woods felt alive in a way they usually didn't. The air was colder, the shadows deeper. My boots crunched softly against the path, the sound strangely loud in the heavy silence. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. This was my forest, my refuge. What could possibly go wrong? I'd made it about half a mile in when I heard it. The scream. It pierced the stillness like a knife, sharp and high-pitched, echoing through the trees. It wasn't the kind of sound you could mistake for an animal. This was human. A woman's scream, filled with agony. My heart lurched in my chest as adrenaline surged through me. I froze, scanning the dark woods with my flashlight, trying to pinpoint the direction. I watched as a woman squirmed in the forbidding forest, laughing and crying. Again, the scream came again, louder this time, and I knew I couldn't just stand there. Someone was in trouble. Without thinking, I broke into a run, veering off the trail and into the dense underbrush. Branches snagged at my jacket, and my boots slipped on damp leaves, but I didn't care. I had to find her. The sound led me deeper into the woods, each cry more desperate than the last. My pulse was hammering in my ears by the time I saw her. She was lying on the ground, motionless. Her body was twisted awkwardly, like she'd been thrown or had fallen. A dark hoodie covered her face, but her arms and legs were pale. Too pale, almost glowing in the moonlight. I hesitated for only a moment before kneeling beside her. "Thank you, Inspector. Appreciate it." "Hey," I said, my voice shaking. No response. My hand hovered over her shoulder, uncertain. She wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. I reached out, fingers brushing her arm, and immediately recoiled. She was cold. Not cold like someone who'd been outside too long. Cold like death. Ice seemed to seep from her skin into mine, and I jerked my hand back, my stomach twisting. And that's when I heard the scream again. It was distant now, far away, deeper in the woods. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what that meant. The sound wasn't coming from her. It never had been. Slowly, I looked down at the girl's body. Her arm twitched. Before I could react, I felt something, an instinct, a warning, compelling me to turn around. My heart thundered as I obeyed, spinning on my heels, flashlight trembling in my grip. She was standing behind me. The girl, or whatever she was, towered over me, her hoodie now pulled back to reveal nothing. No face, just smooth, blank skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just stood there, featureless and silent. My blood turned to ice as I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam shaking wildly. What are you—" I stammered, my voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because from somewhere deep within the woods, the scream came again. At this time, it was closer. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and bolt, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped between the girl's faceless stare and the sound of that haunting scream growing closer. My flashlight shook in my hands, the beam bouncing off the trees like a warning signal. But it did nothing to pierce the darkness swallowing me whole. "Stay back," I managed to croak, though my voice was barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. Description 1. She tilted her head as if studying me, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her blank face reflected the dim light of the flashlight, and I swear I saw something. A ripple move across the smooth surface where her features should have been. The scream came again, closer now, almost right on top of us. But it wasn't just a scream anymore. There was something else underneath it, something deeper, guttural, like the low rumble of an animal growling in the distance. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Suddenly, the girl moved. Not walked, moved. One moment she was standing a few feet away, and the next she was inches from my face. The flashlight flickered as she raised a hand, skeletal and pale, her fingers unnaturally long. She pointed to something over my shoulder, her movements sharp and deliberate, like a marionette on strings. I didn't want to look. I knew that whatever was behind me wasn't something I was meant to see, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, as if in a trance, I turned the flashlight toward the direction she was pointing. The beam landed on the trees, their bark peeling and twisted like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. For a moment, I thought there was nothing there, just shadows and branches and, It blinked. A pair of glowing, lidless eyes stared back at me from the darkness, unblinking, unrelenting. They hovered too high to belong to any person, too still to belong to any animal I'd ever known. My breath caught as the thing stepped closer, its massive frame outlined against the shadows. It wasn't just one figure. There were dozens. Shapes emerged from the darkness, silent and deliberate. Some had the same blank, faceless appearance as the girl, while others had twisted, grotesque features, smiles stretched too wide, eyes too many or too few. They surrounded me in a loose circle, their movements synchronized, as if they were all controlled by the same invisible hand. The girl let out a sound, a low, croaking noise that seemed to ripple through the air like static. The figures stopped. The scream, so near just moments ago, fell silent, and then they stepped closer. Panic finally broke through the paralysis gripping me. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without looking back. Branches tore at my face and arms, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between me and whatever those things were. The forest seemed endless, every tree a copy of the last, every shadow hiding something waiting to grab me. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. But the scream returned. It came from everywhere at once, surrounding me, chasing me, driving me deeper into the woods. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through my wrist as I tried to catch myself, but I barely noticed, because they were here. The sound of footsteps surrounded me. Soft, deliberate, and far too many to count. I scrambled to my feet, backing against a tree as the figures closed in. Their blank faces and distorted features glowed faintly in the moonlight. Their eyes, or lack thereof, fixed on me. The girl stepped forward, her head tilting once more. This time, her voice was clear, though it wasn't a voice meant for human ears. It was layered, fractured, as if 1,000 voices were speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come." I tried to speak, but my throat closed. the words dying before they could form. She raised a hand, her long fingers curling toward me. The figures around her mimicked the gesture, their movements synchronized and terrifyingly precise. She smiled, and then she spoke again, her voice echoing inside my skull. "You belong to us now." Their words echoed in my mind, each syllable feeling like ice digging into my skull. "You belong to us now." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My legs trembled beneath me, and I pressed harder against the tree, as if somehow its bark could shield me from the impossible horror closing in. The girl stepped closer, her movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette tangled in invisible strings. The air grew colder with every step she took, and the figures around her followed suit, tightening their circle. Their blank faces reflected the faint moonlight, their featureless stares burrowing into my soul. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The girl raised her hand, and I felt something pull at me. Not my body, but my mind. It was as if invisible threads were winding around my thoughts, dragging me toward her against my will. My vision blurred, the edges of my reality warping like smoke. "Stop," I finally croaked, my voice barely audible. My chest felt tight, like I was being suffocated by the very air around me. "Captain Struble sent for me," Captain Biara said. The girl tilted her head again, almost curiously, as if my defiance amused her. "You shouldn't have followed the scream," she said, her voice shifting into something darker, layered, ancient. "You heard it. You came. You are ours now." From the corner of my eye, I saw the others move. They didn't walk. They glided, their forms dissolving into shadow and reappearing closer, always closer. My breath hitched as I realized they weren't just surrounding me. They were absorbing the forest. The trees around us twisted and blackened, their bark cracking and curling like burning paper. The ground beneath my feet began to sink, the soil turning cold and damp, pulling me downward. "You don't belong here," I shouted, though my words felt hollow, meaningless. My flashlight, long dead, slipped from my hand and hit the ground with a soft thud. The girl froze, her faceless head tilting upward as if she were listening to something. The others stopped too, their movements eerily synchronized. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was silence. And then I heard it. Another scream, louder than before. But this one wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from inside me. It scared. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the sound tore through my mind, splitting me apart. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was rage. Pure, unfiltered, inhuman rage. My vision blurred, and I felt a sharp, icy pressure against my chest, like a hand reaching through me. The girl knelt in front of me, her head tilting to match mine, her blank face inches from my own. "You shouldn't have looked," she whispered. Her hand shot forward, and suddenly I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was standing in my house. The sudden shift was jarring. One moment I was kneeling in the forest, surrounded by faceless horrors, and the next I was back in my living room, the pale morning light filtering through the curtains. My heart pounded as I spun around, expecting to see them, but there was nothing. No figures, no screams, no shadows. Had it been a dream, a hallucination? I stumbled to the mirror hanging on the wall, my reflection staring back at me, pale and trembling. My eyes were bloodshot, my clothes torn and covered in dirt. I leaned closer, desperate for some sign that it had all been real, or that it hadn't. And then I saw it. The face in the mirror wasn't mine. It was hers. Blank. Featureless. Staring back at me with an expression that didn't exist. I stumbled backward, the mirror cracking as my hand hit the edge. My reflection didn't move. It stayed there, frozen, watching me. "You belong to us now," it whispered, though its lips didn't move. The last thing I remember is the mirror shattering as the scream filled my ears again, louder than ever, consuming me until there was nothing left. The person on the floor was dressed quickly and picked up my reins. Smiling, the man said that he was driving with his daughter around the area to visit her mother. Story 2. The Shadows Detour. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside your car feels more like a void than a landscape. The only things keeping me company on the empty highway were the hum of the engine and the soothing monotone of the navigation system guiding me home. "Continue straight for 5 kilometers, the GPS said. I was half asleep, lulled by the rhythmic streak of streetlights, when the device stuttered. The screen flickered once, twice, then recalculated. Rerouting, it said. I glanced at the screen, frowning. The route had changed. Instead of keeping me on the main road, the GPS now directed me to take a left turn onto what looked like a dirt path. "Still, turn left," the voice said, its tone calm and insistent. He hesitated, gripping the wheel tighter. There was no sign for a turn, no indication that a road even existed. But the GPS had never led me astray before, and in my exhaustion, I'd trusted it. I turned left. The road was barely a road at all, just a narrow, winding path, flanked by tall trees that blocked out the moonlight. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the uneven terrain and the occasional glint of animal eyes. Sitting to the right of my path was a man with high cheekbones and a heavy mustache. His eyes were wide and he appeared to be sleeping. "Continue for 1 kilometer, the GPS instructed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier here, the quiet more oppressive. Even the faint hum of the radio seemed muffled, swallowed by the night. When I reached the 1 kilometer mark, the voice spoke again. "Stop." I hit the brakes, the car lurching to a halt. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I glanced at the GPS screen, hoping for further instructions, but it had gone black. Intentionally or not, I had crossed the road selfishly to escape Alyssa Stewart. "Hello?" I said aloud, feeling ridiculous for talking to a machine. The voice returned. But it wasn't the calm, robotic tone I was used to. This voice was distorted, layered, almost human. "Now, look behind you." Chill ran down my spine. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The voice didn't respond. Instead, the radio crackled to life, static filling the car as the faint whisper of a tune drifted through the speakers. Then elicited I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to put the car in drive and speed away, but some compulsion, forced me to glance into the rearview mirror. At first there was nothing, just the dark road behind me, empty and endless. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, the road stretched into the darkness, empty and still. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that the eerie voice from the GPS was just my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. And then it moved. A shadow, long and distorted, slithered across the road like spilled ink. It wasn't the shadow of a tree or an animal. It moved with purpose, deliberate and slow, growing larger as it approached the car. My chest tightened as I stared, unable to look away. The shadow stopped just behind the car, pooling there like it was waiting. The GPS crackled to life again, its voice sharp and distorted. "Get out." After an hour of working out, Peter arrived, tired and fatigued. "Go to sleep, Elizabeth," he said. "I'm ready to shower." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly it felt like I might snap it in half. The radio cut through the static, a faint, broken melody seeping into the cabin. It was an old tune, one I couldn't quite place, but its familiarity only made it more unsettling. "Get out," the voice repeated, louder this time, each word dripping with an unnatural authority. The shadow began to rise. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It stretched upward, taking on a vaguely human shape, though its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally hunched. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just standing. It was looking at me, the void where its face should have been tilted, its attention fixed on me. The GPS spoke again, its tone low and mocking. "He's waiting." My hands trembled as I reached for the gear shift, desperate to get away. But as soon as I put the car into drive, the headlights flickered, the engine sputtering before dying completely. "No, no, no," I muttered, frantically turning the key. The engine refused to start. From behind, I heard it. The steps were slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel road. I didn't dare turn around. My eyes stayed glued to the rearview mirror, where the figure was now moving closer, its form flickering in and out like a bad signal. "Good. Neighbor, get out," the voice demanded again, the speakers vibrating with the force of the words. The shadow stopped just outside the driver's side door. The air inside the car grew cold, frost creeping along the edges of the windshield. My breath fogged as I stared straight ahead, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the faint scratching sound that started at the window. It was knocking. "Tim, Tim, 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 Tim." A single, deliberate tap on the glass. And then another. I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head. The face, or what should have been a face, was inches from the glass. It was a void, a swirling absence of features, but I could feel its gaze. My stomach churned as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. The GPS crackled, the words cutting through the chaos. "Let him in." I shook my head violently, screaming, "No! Go away!" The shadow paused, its head tilting slightly. Then, slowly, it began to move. Not away, up. I followed its movement, my eyes widening in horror as it crawled onto the roof of the car. The metal groaned under its weight, the entire vehicle shuddering as it moved. The GPS spoke one final time, its voice a guttural rasp. "He's already inside." The roof groaned, the sound reverberating through the car like nails on a chalkboard. I pressed myself back into the seat, my chest heaving, my hands clutching the wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. "It's a timer for the accelerator," I said, and shoved the victim's head down into the tiny doorway. The shadow was still above me. I could feel its weight shifting, the faint creak of metal as it moved. The air inside the car grew colder, so cold that frost spread across the windows in jagged patterns, obscuring the world outside. Aspen and Andrew both cried out with horror. And then it started tapping again. This time it wasn't on the window. It was on the roof. 3 deliberate knocks. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The tapping stopped. For a moment the car was silent, save for my ragged breathing. Then the GPS crackled to life again, its screen flickering with static. "Look at me," the voice commanded. "No!" I screamed, my hands shaking. The shadow didn't care. The tapping resumed, faster now, more frantic, like it was trying to break through the metal. The radio hissed, static flooding the cabin, as a voice began to emerge. It wasn't the distorted tone of the GPS this time. It was a recording. But I heard my own voice, muffled and distant, as though someone had been following me, recording my conversations. My life. "Turn it off," I shouted, slamming my hand against the dashboard. But the recording grew louder, fragments of words and phrases playing on a loop. My laughter, my phone calls, and then, finally, the last words I heard before leaving home that night. An excerpt from the magazine that my great-grandfather had found in the corner of a closet somewhere in Great Boston. "I'll be back soon." The roof creaked violently, the sound deafening. My hands shot to the door handle, desperate to escape. But the moment I touched it, the entire car went silent. And then, from directly above me, I heard it. A whisper. You should have listened. The whisper sent a jolt of cold terror through my body, freezing me in place. The roof creaked one last time before the shadow began to descend. The shadow overwhelmed me, and I whimpered, scared to the base of my bones. Not outside the car. Inside. It seeped through the seams of the roof, the edges of the doors, curling into the cabin like smoke. The darkness moved with purpose, pooling in the passenger seat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the shadow took shape beside me. Its form was human-like, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The void where its face should have been seemed to pulse, drawing my gaze like a black hole. I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The shadow turned its head toward me, the air in the cabin growing colder with every passing second. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once, deep and guttural, layered with something ancient and inhuman. You followed? My chest tightened as its words sank in. The GPS, the voice. It had been leading me here. "Who are you?" "I didn't know," I screamed, my voice breaking. "I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know." The shadow tilted its head further, as if mocking me. "You heard me. You obeyed. Now, you belong to me." The air around me thickened, pressing against my chest like a weight. My vision blurred as the darkness spread, wrapping around the steering wheel, the dashboard, my legs. It was like a big snake beginning to sick through the car. "Let me go," I shouted, thrashing against its grip. The shadow leaned closer, its presence suffocating. Its face, or lack of one, was now inches from mine. "Look at me," it whispered. My head moved on its own, my gaze locking onto the swirling void where its eyes should have been. And in that moment, I saw everything. Everything I hadn't. Everything since my childhood. Graymore's voice grew louder. Flashes of images burned into my mind. Roads that led nowhere. Faces twisted in agony. Lives consumed by this thing. I saw myself sitting in the car screaming as the darkness pulled me under. And then I saw nothing. The car was found the next morning, abandoned on the dirt road. The doors were locked, the engine cold. The GPS sat on the dashboard, its screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. When the police powered it on, it displayed a single phrase. "Who? Enet."